In this lesson, we'll talk about some things that you'll need to know whenever using textures with Maxwell Render. Okay, so for this example, I'm just going to use this very simple cube object. If I pull open my Fire preview render, you can see what we have here. Again, just simple object, default lighting, default materials at this point. So let's start by applying a new material to this, and we'll start to talk about the process of using textures. So let's start by just selecting this cube object. We can right-click, assign new material, and let's start by just dropping in a Maxwell layered material. Okay, so if we wanted to give this some sort of a surface texture, we plug those textures into the reflectance. Again, if you recall from our previous lesson, the reflectance really just refers to the color information that gets reflected back to your eye or back to the camera. That can be a reflectivity color, or it can also be a surface color. So to do this, we would texture this up just like we would any other material. Just click on this little checker button, and now plug in the texture that we want. Now, very important thing to keep in mind, and that is the fact that any Maya procedural textures will not render inside of Maxwell. So really, when it comes to rendering textures with Maxwell, the only thing that we can use is this File Texture node. So we have to use things like JPEGs, bitmap, targas, things like that. So now we just plug in the texture that we want. So in my case, if you take a look inside the source images directory, let's start with this brick color. Let's go ahead and open that up, and there we go. So you can see now we have this brick color map that's been assigned to this cube. Now, if we wanted to change some of the placement options on this, we can, again, go to our Place 2D Texture node. And now this is, again, going to really work a lot like any other texture. So if we wanted to change the number of tiles on this, we could change the repeat U and V to something like 5 and 5. Now, it's important to note that not all of these attributes work when it comes to using Maxwell Render. So, for example, if we had these bricks oriented in a certain way, and let's say we decided at some point maybe we'd like to have these bricks maybe rotated 90 degrees so that they point upward. Well, if we try to use this rotate frame, you'll notice that inside of Maxwell Render, it doesn't work. So, what we really have to do in this case is one of two things. We would need to either go into Photoshop or some other image editing application and actually rotate that texture and then save it back out, bring it back into Maya. Or if you have the ability, you could just simply adjust maybe the UVs on your object. So we could take this cube geometry, go into the UV texture editor. Okay, let's go ahead and maybe just set this to use the file so that way our texture's nice and sharp. Maybe just darken this up a little bit. There we are. So we can grab maybe just all of the UVs in here. Again, just right click. Let's grab all of these. And now just rotate those around. And you can see as I'm rotating and moving my UVs, the texture can update over here. So that's how we can go about changing our textures as far as the rotation inside of Maya. Now we do also have some really simple controls as far as getting some independent behavior over the reflectance 0 and the reflectance 90. So let's just very quickly, I'm going to go back to my texture editor here and get that UV rotated back so that way we have our bricks nice and flat. Now, I'm going to go into my reflectance 90 and plug in another brick texture. I'll actually use the same one in this case. So I'll click on the map button, plug in a file, File 2, we'll plug in that same brick color map. There we go. And make sure that we go in and set the repeat U and repeat V to be the same. Now, looking at this, you may not see a whole lot of difference. But what we could do is, if we start to come in here and adjust things like the roughness value, if you recall from one of our earlier lessons, as we start to dial down this roughness value, this is where we can start to see some of the independent behaviors between the reflectance 0 and the reflectance 90. The problem, though, is that right now they use the exact same texture, which means it really looks exactly the same from any angle. Now, what we can do is go into the reflectance 90, and let's say we wanted this brick texture to look maybe a little bit different, a little bit darker maybe as we start to view it a little bit more indirectly. Well, to help us do that, we have some Maxwell image controls. So scroll down, unfold this rollout where we have the Maxwell image controls. And this is where we can start to adjust things like brightness, contrast, saturation, whether we invert this image or whether we use the alpha channel of this image. It sort of helps to take the place of some of these color balance controls that we would normally have up here, and instead shifts those down here for use within Maxwell. Now, to see this in action, if I go back to my viewport and press the 6 key on my keyboard, we can see now a textured view. So if we were to come in here and let's say adjust the brightness on this texture, we can see the slider changing and we can start to see the result within our render, but we really don't get any sort of interactive texture feedback. So what we can do is enable what's called the viewport override. So if we turn on the viewport override, we are currently seeing the textured result of this material, or this texture I should say. So as we start to adjust things like the brightness, we can see exactly what that is doing and what that looks like. So we can maybe dial that down, maybe give that a little less saturation. There we go. Just making a few little changes here for the sake of demonstration. Okay, so once we have this set up, we could now just simply remove that viewport override, and now it just takes us back to the material as a whole. Really, this is just a way of temporarily overriding the viewport so we can easily see some of these different changes that we're making, and then once we're done, we can turn that back off. Now let's go back to the material itself, and now as we start to come in here and make some of these changes to something like the roughness value, we can maybe now get a little bit better idea of where we can start to see maybe just a slightly brighter version of this texture in some of these more directly viewed areas. As we start to shift down into some of these more indirectly viewed areas, we get this slightly darker version of the same texture. Now we can also start to use things like bump maps to help pull out some of this detail. So if we click on our bump texture, again, we'll just plug in a texture for this, go back to our source images, and this time we'll use this brick bump. Let's click on that and go back to our Place 2D texture. Make sure that we have the repeats set to match what we have on our color map. In this case, I have that set to 5 and 5. There we are. We can maybe get in here a little bit closer so we can see this. And now you can start to see the effect of this bump map starting to take effect. If we were using something like a normal map, we could plug it into the exact same port, but then just turn on this normal map option. And now we can, instead of using a black and white normal map, or rather a black and white bump map, we could use a tangent space normal map or something like that. So with this bump texture plugged in, we now can start to dial up this bump strength if we want to. You can see where that's now starting to affect the overall bumpiness of this. We can go to positive or negative values, whichever we want. And to just bring that a little bit more in focus, we could just go back to our camera. I have a little bit of my scene that is a little bit out of focus, sort of right here at this point. So I can just go back to my manual focus distance, like we've seen earlier, and start to adjust this value until the area that I want comes into focus. There we are. So now to see this in action, sometimes you can get a little bit better idea of what this looks like by sometimes just bypassing the fire window. This sometimes tends to soften out some of the details, so it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to see some of your bump details especially. So let's make sure that we are set to use Maxwell Render and shoot this over. Okay, and there's our final image. So you can see rendering this actually inside of the Maxwell Render, our details tend to be a little bit sharper, a little bit crisper, but using the Fire preview window can give us a relatively good idea, at least, of what this is going to look like. So overall, the process of using textures inside of Maxwell Render, really very straightforward, not too terribly different from any other material type that you're used to working with. Just keep in mind that when it comes to Maxwell Render, you cannot use Maya procedural textures, and also when it comes to making adjustments to your placement, not all of these attributes will work. Okay, so in our next lesson, we're going to take a look at the process of using material presets inside of Maxwell.